Hello, my name is Michael O'Keefe, aka The Movie Wist. If you enjoy this interview and want to hear more top-notch film industry conversations, please press the thumbs up, subscribe to this channel, and hit the bell to stay in the know. Steve Ryfle, please tell me when you first got into Godzilla.
Oh, as a child. And my generation is the generation that grew up in the 1970s. And so at that time, you still had a lot of movies that had originally come out probably in the 50s and 60s as B movies and drive-ins and downtown movie theaters that, science fiction, horror pictures. And now they were playing when I was growing up on television, often on, Saturday afternoons, or we had the 3:30 movie that I would run home from school to see. And we had the $1 Million Movie in Los Angeles where I grew up, which would play. It was a program where they would play the same movie every night, Monday through Friday at about 7:30 or 8 o'clock, as I recall. And then they would show it again on Sunday. Pretty low budget stuff, typically westerns or gangster pictures or monster pictures. So I was, and so these were the pictures that I gravitated to, the monster and horror pictures. And and it was kind of this great time to be a kid. I mean, and there was also the sort of first wave of merchandise. There were model kits that appeared of Godzilla and King Kong and the creature from the Black Lagoon. And so, now this stuff is commonplace. I also was a big reader of comic books, particularly Marvel comics. And one of the big differences between now and then is that when I was growing up, if you were into this stuff, you were considered kind of a geek, kind of a weirdo. And there was this club of, a few of us who were proud weirdos who talked about this stuff constantly, but we were kind of looked at askance by the other kids. And now this stuff is everywhere. The geek generation of the 70s and 80s grew up and kind of took over Hollywood and all popular culture. So I got into it by watching a lot of TV, and occasionally when these things would play at the movies, I would do that too.
Please pitch to my audience why they should pick up your biography on Ishiro Honda.
Ishiro Honda was during the golden age of foreign cinema, which is arguably the 50s and especially the 60s in North America and the United States and Canada. He was the unsung, most successful on an international scale director out of Japan. When everybody was talking about Akira Kurosawa, who was and arguably still is the first name in Japanese cinema, unbeknownst to everyone, Ishiro Honda's movies were actually reaching a far bigger audience worldwide. He's a very, very influential and yet unsung director of science fiction cinema. He's the director of the original Godzilla, which is an enormously influential film, and a film that is still going strong more than 60 years after its original release. It was released in its director's cut for the first time across North America on its 50th anniversary in 2004, and again on its 60th anniversary in 2014. And as you know, there's a big Hollywood franchise of Godzilla movies now that is, a direct descendant of that. And of course, Honda not only directed the original Godzilla, but many, many of the most popular sequels that came over from Japan to North America during the 50s and the 60s. And he also directed a lot of other science fiction films that are now considered classics or cult classics, if you will. Films like Rodan and the Mysterians, Mothra, Frankenstein Conquers the World, The War of the Gargantuas. These films were, when I was growing up, these films were a constant presence on television, and they've influenced a lot of people who are now very successful and very influential genre film directors in their own right, people like Guillermo del Toro.
Okay, so who are some other great Godzilla directors?
Well, there's not a lot of them. Honda was the original director, and his original film was imbued with his stamp, his directorial stamp. As you may know, the first film uses the monster as this metaphor, a visual metaphor, or an allegory of the atomic bombs that destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And Honda himself was a war veteran. He had reluctantly served in the Imperial Army for the better part of 10 years. And he nearly died in combat. He was taken prisoner of war at the end of the war. And when he was repatriated, he passed through the wreckage of Hiroshima several months after the bombing. And so he used that first film as an anti-war statement, as a cautionary tale. And that's one of the reasons that I think it has survived and remained relevant for so long. But he also, as time went on and the war faded further and further into memory, and Japan became, a post-war success story and a prosperous democratic country, the films kind of became brighter and more entertainment-oriented and more lighthearted. And but so he directed, like the films that I just mentioned are some of the most popular in this genre, but there are other people who eventually would take the reins of the Godzilla franchise. Honda, started to do other films, and at a certain point he actually got tired of doing these sort of films, and he begged off for a while, and then he eventually retired in the early 70s. But there were other directors like a man named Jun Fukuda, who is one of my favorites. He directed films like Godzilla versus the Sea Monster and Son of Godzilla, which are viewed by hardcore fans as, some of the lesser entries in the genre. But Fukuda is actually a very, very good director, and his specialty was action, and his films are very different than Honda's in that regard. They're very fast-paced, and they have more of a flair for action, and there are a lot of chase scenes and things like that. Some of his films are very influenced by the spy genre and James Bond. He actually directed a series of films in the 60s that were spoofs of the James Bond series. So he's another one that I quite like. And then one other person I'll mention is a gentleman who passed away not too long ago named Yoshimitsu Banno, who only directed one Godzilla film, but it's one that a lot of people have heard of, called Godzilla versus Hedorah, or Godzilla versus the Smog Monster. And that's the one that's infamous for Godzilla fighting this big pile of living sludge. And at the end of the movie, Godzilla, by this point, in the early 70s, the movies had kind of taken a comic turn. And that's the film where Godzilla tucks its tail between its legs and actually flies through the air improbably.
So, what did you contribute to the Criterion Collection release of the Godzilla, the Shōwa Era films box set?
This is the first time that the original 15 Godzilla films, spanning from Ishiro Honda's original film from 1954 through a film called Terror of Mechagodzilla, made in 1975, which is Honda's last film as a director. This is the first time that all of those 15 films have been collected in one set, released in the Western world. And it's also significant, I think, because it's the first time ever that the original Japanese cut of the director's cut of King Kong versus Godzilla has been made available commercially in North America. And that's significant because King Kong versus Godzilla is really one of them. It's in Japan, it's the most financially successful Godzilla film of all time. And it was one of the most financially successful films of 1962, the year that it was released, which is a banner year at the box office for Japanese cinema. It made tons of money. But the film is very different as seen in Japan and in the United States. In Japan, the film was a corporate satire. It was a comedy. And it was basically poking fun at the popularity of Japanese television and some of the lowbrow programming that was being shown in the late 50s, early 60s. And there was a lot of controversy over that. The film was kind of a parody or a satire of that. In the United States, the film was heavily, heavily recut. And even though in the United States the film was also very successful financially, it's always been considered a terrible film. It's one of those films that tended to make worst of lists. And this is the first time people can see it in its original form. It's much different, and it's actually a very clever film. What I contributed, and my writing partner, Ed Gadziszewski, he and I are the co-authors of the Ishiro Honda biography that was published 2 years ago from Wesleyan University Press. We contributed a number of written pieces to the wonderful book that the Shōwa Godzilla Criterion set comes in. It's a big, unusually large, hardcover bound book with original artwork by a whole slew of amazing and talented and famous comic book artists. And it's a thing to behold. But there's a long essay in the front of the book called Reign of Destruction, which I wrote, which is kind of an overview of the Shōwa Godzilla franchise. And then Ed contributed these shorter pieces describing each one of the 15 films, a little bit of a plot synopsis with contextual notes on, things that, were happening around the time that the film was released, and or, just some sort of significant pieces of information that help put it into context.
What can you say about the restorations? How do the movies look?
Well, the films were sourced from masters that were provided by Toho Company, which is the Japanese studio that owns Godzilla and controls the rights to the films. And I believe Criterion did a certain amount of restoration work, but the films had already been remastered and, I guess, restored to a certain degree some years ago. And so the films do look pretty good. Some of them look better than others. These are, of course, some of these films are going on 50, 60 years old. And so I'd say the first film, Godzilla 54, looks great. That's the product of a restoration that was conducted by Criterion itself some years ago, about 7 or 8 years ago. So that looks fantastic. And as well as the American version of that film, Godzilla King of the Monsters, which is the version of the film that has Raymond Burr cut in very cleverly. And that was how the film was originally released in North America and other parts of the world. And that's how the film was basically known up until 2004, when the director's cut was first released across the United States.
What's it like to do business with Criterion?
Well, this is the first time that Ed and I have worked with them, and it is something that we aspired to do for a number of years. We have worked together on many projects for a number of different home video distributors, including Sony and a company called Classic Media, another company called Media Blasters, and I've also worked. And he's done some work for other companies on his own, and so have I. But Criterion is kind of it's the ultimate. I mean, in classic film distribution in this format. So their work is always known to be at a level of exceptional quality. And so we were and normally, we have to apply for these kinds of jobs. It's a competitive type of work. But in this case, we were kind of flattered because Criterion reached out to us kind of out of the blue. We didn't know this project was happening. So it was an honor to work with them. The process was very smooth. And to boot, they have really good editors. This is a very text-heavy assignment. On other jobs, we've done things like record audio commentaries for certain films. But in this case, we were writing a ton of material. And it was actually fun to work with them at Criterion because their editorial staff is not only are they experts on cinema and classic film, but they are also good editors and good writers. So it was all around a great experience. And I think the product is something that we're really proud to be associated with. And I think this is a really first class release, and it's really nice because, as you probably know, this type of film, the Japanese giant monster film, is a genre that was subjected to ridicule for many years. I mean, it originally arrived in the United States at a time when products from Japan were viewed with suspicion. They were, back then everybody bought American, and they went to American, movies, and they bought American cars, and they bought American appliances and things for their homes. So when Japanese goods started to be exported to the West, transistor radios and the like, and here comes these films from Japan, people just kind of, reflexively, based on their prejudices against Japanese stuff, just assumed that these films were no good. And from the beginning, they were dubbed, and dubbing the voices into another language adds a layer of unintentional comedy, because it takes the original performance away and turns it into something of a caricature. So there've always, these films have always kind of had to reach an audience through these layers of interference, as it's called sometimes, and they were recut, and so sometimes the re-editing that was done to them was really slipshod, and the music was changed, all kinds of things that they've had to deal with. And so it's nice to see these films, after all this time, finally reach an audience in the way that they were intended to be seen originally, and they can be judged on their own merits, really, in many cases, for the first time ever. And that's a really wonderful thing. We're living in a time when it's a good time to be a film fan.
Do you have a favorite Godzilla movie?
Not really. I mean, I would say that the first film is my favorite, if only because, without it, we're not here talking about the other 14 films in this set and all the other films that have come after it. They're still making Godzilla films now, and as you know, they're making them in Hollywood for a lot more money and with much higher tech than the Japanese films are typically made. But the first film is really the one that matters most, because it's the one that continues to resonate. It was made 9 years after the end of the war. It was made by people who had experienced the war. So the film is really kind of beneath the monster movie story, and not terribly far beneath, but it's about the collective experience of the Japanese people during and after the war. And it resonated very clearly with the audience at the time that it was made. And Honda, the director, was very worried about nuclear proliferation and the arms race that was just beginning at that time. And he tried to warn the world through his little monster movie. And the warning, which comes very directly at the end of the film, where one of the characters, played by the great actor Takashi Shimura, speaks almost directly into the camera and says, paraphrasing, but he says, if we don't stop testing nuclear weapons, another Godzilla may appear. And what he's really saying there, in so many words, is if we don't stop the arms race, we're going to blow ourselves up. We've given ourselves the power to destroy our world, to destroy ourselves. This was something that Honda really worried about. And here we are 65 years later. We just celebrated Godzilla's 65th birthday like a month ago. In Japan, there was a lot of celebrating. But here we are 65 years later, and that message is still true. It's more true than it ever was, because now we have countries, including our own president in the United States, talking very, at times, cavalierly about the prospect of nuclear war, as if it's something you can do on a weekend and go back to work on Monday. It's not that way. We're living in very dangerous times, and that's really what Godzilla is all about. And so it's the first film that will always mean the most to me.
Has Godzilla as a metaphor for nuclear war evolved over the years?
Well, different at different times, different filmmakers that have taken the directorial reins of the series or of individual films have used Godzilla in different ways. And for instance, I mentioned the film Godzilla versus the Smog Monster, or Godzilla versus Hedorah, as it's known in Japan. That was a film made at a time when Japan's industrial post-war revolution was kind of taking its toll in the form of severe, air and water pollution. There were cities that were living under, you know, thick layers of smog, and there were waterways that were polluted very heavily. There were instances where entire towns were becoming sick from the water, and there was a government investigation into a particular crisis that was, major news for a long period of time. And so the film, uses well, not Godzilla specifically, but the giant monster genre as a kind of parallel, and again, very direct, like the first film, for this problem that Japan was dealing with. More recently, there was a film called Shin Godzilla that came out in 2016 in Japan. It was actually a huge commercial hit. But in that film, Godzilla is quite clearly a metaphor or a representation of, if you will, of the Fukushima disaster that happened a few years before. And at the end of the movie, Godzilla's basically laying in or in stasis in the middle of Tokyo, and it's kind of representative. I don't know if it was intentional or not, but kind of looks vaguely like a representation of the Hulk of the Fukushima power plant, the nuclear reactor that just remains there years after the disaster, and is has created this sort of disaster zone around it. And so from time to time, yeah, Godzilla has meant different things, within the context of things that are going on in the world. And that's one of the nice things about it, is that it sort of has adopted with the changing times.
So, what are your thoughts on the Hollywood Godzilla movies?
Well, there have been three of them so far. There was one in 1998, 21 years ago, made by Roland Emmerich and Dean Devlin. They were, at the time, the hot director-producer team. They had just come off of Independence Day, which was a major hit. And that Godzilla film was kind of this tongue-in-cheek thing that was made in their style. They really didn't they didn't show a great love for the Japanese Godzilla movies in that film. They completely, well, not completely, but they to a large extent, they redesigned the creature to a point where it was almost unrecognizable, which is strange because you wouldn't want to take Superman or Batman and change their costume to the point where it doesn't look like Superman or Batman anymore. But that's kind of what they did with Godzilla, and it didn't behave the way Godzilla typically behaves. What they really wanted to do was make a Jurassic Park movie, and they had a whole scene where the baby Godzillas are running around in New York, kind of like the raptors in the Jurassic Park movies. So that movie wasn't terribly good. I think if you're a fan of this stuff, it was disappointing, to say the least. And then in 2014, there was another attempt to reboot the franchise in Hollywood, and that was made over at Legendary and Warner Brothers. And I don't love that film, but it did try to take the character or the monster. Godzilla's not really a character per se, but it's a it tried to take the monster back to its roots of representing basically an extinction level event type of calamity, and it's difficult to say exactly what Godzilla is represents in that film, but it's sort of this force of nature. It's an earth force that is reappearing at a time. After a long period of time, it appears again to basically combat or confront something that has arrived that threatens the existence or the survival of the planet. So Godzilla is kind of like this earth force, this environmental force. And then they just released the sequel to that this past summer, called Godzilla King of the Monsters, taking the title from the Raymond Burr version of the first film from 60 some years ago, 63 years before. And I thought that was a total mess, actually. It was irrespective of whether it's a Godzilla movie or not, it was just a terrible movie. It was terribly written, terribly directed. The plot is just, it's an insult to the intelligence of the audience. And there are a lot of monsters in it. It's supposed to be, I guess, a throwback to the Japanese films where Godzilla and his monster cohorts all share the screen. It has Rodan, one of my favorite monsters, and admittedly, the Rodan sequence in the film is my favorite part of it. Mothra is in the film, and King Ghidorah, the three-headed monster, is in the film. But I don't know. I mean, all the monster film, they didn't really. One of the fun things about the Toho films, especially after they went to widescreen in the 50s and 60s, sometimes you have these glorious widescreen vistas. And yes, these were men in suits, acting out their monster roles on a miniature set on a soundstage. But often some of the photography of some of these scenes could be kind of breathtaking. And they had this monster, King Ghidorah, which was, again, a man in a suit, an impossibly large suit with three heads on long necks, operated by puppeteers overhead, big giant wings. And then when this thing would fly over a city, it was kind of a sight to behold because all the parts of it were moving. And when you appreciate the handmade practical effects that were done to make that happen, it's pretty amazing how they pulled it off back then with the real primitive, by today's standards, methods that they were using. By contrast, in this film, you don't really get that sort of glorious shot. All the monster scenes, or almost all of them, seem to take place in the rain or in a snowstorm, and there are so many cuts, and they cut away from things that you want to see. And King Ghidorah, this glorious monster from vintage Godzilla, vintage Toho, you never really get a great look at it. I mean, it's always kind of, it's either standing on the ground, or when it's flying through the air, it flies through this kind of storm cloud that follows it around. So you never get a great look at it. So their choices and their the filmmaker's idea of how to present these creatures is different. But the main thing about it that I was disappointed in was I just thought the entire story that they came up with was rather childish and stupid. Did you see it?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. No, I agree. I don't think Hollywood's gotten it yet. Maybe fourth time's the charm. I don't know.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I really think that Godzilla belongs in Japan. That's where it's from, and you can try to recreate it here, but Japan has this history of being ravaged by natural disasters, and it has and then the earthquake and multiple earthquakes, but the Kanto earthquake and then the atomic bombing. These creatures wreaking havoc on Japanese cities. I think the the metaphorical meaning of that is something that I think is going to resonate more closely with a Japanese audience than it ever will here with our audiences. And also there's with Shinto and the yokai tradition, there's a synergy or a symbiosis between nature and human life that I think Godzilla is related to in some ways. Maybe not directly or overtly in the films, but I think there's an understanding there. And here Godzilla is just a big monster, and Hollywood always tries to come up with some sort of rational explanation for why it exists, and it doesn't quite work. But God bless him for trying.
Mm-hmm. All right, well, Steve Ryfle, thank you for your time. What do you have planned for 2020?
Well, in terms of this genre, which is big part of my life, I am working on a book that will be finished in 2020. I don't know the publication date yet, but it's titled Godzilla versus the World: The Politics of Japan's Disaster Monster. And it's a little different than what I've done before. It's actually a selective history of the genre viewed through the prism of geopolitics. It's basically about how the films, particularly the first film, but a number of other ones as well, reflect the changing nature of the Japan-U.S. relationship after the war. And, as I've had the opportunity to spend more time with these films and writing about Ishiro Honda and just getting a little deeper into what makes some of these movies tick, I became very interested in how they reflect, the politics of the day when they were made at any given time. And so the book will move through about 60 years of history with Godzilla, and I think it's kind of fascinating, something different.
All right, well, thank you so much, and we'll stay tuned to that.
Thank you for the opportunity.